Okay, so for this week, we're going to go ahead and get started with taking a look at things with a little bit different aspect. For this week, we're going to be looking at glass and water. Well, we're going to go ahead and begin with the glass side of things, which by itself is going to be pretty simple. So, still working with Arnold like we have been before, we're going to go into the surface and do a standard surface. Okay, so I'll get rid of this one. I'll make a new one just so we can see it. I'll collapse it, bring this up just so I have a little bit easier thing to look at. And I'm going to make sure that this is assigned to both of my objects. Now, I chose these two just for a few specific things, but this is what we're going to want for now. That said, I'm also going to go active shade. And I'm looking at something about like this. Now, as you'll see, I do have a light in my scene, and I can free to expand that out if I wish. I can make it a little bit brighter if I want. Kind of just whatever we need to at the time. So I'll zoom back in. I'll go about like this. And as I just let it render out just a little bit in my active one, it looks, pretty good overall. But we want this to be glass. So what we have to do is change a handful of different things. Now in here, we've already taken a look at using the base, about specular, and a lot of these other options. Now, just to make it easier to look at, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these for the moment. And what we're going to be doing is a combination of specular and transmission. So specular and transmission. First off, I need to go ahead and check a few things. Well, first off, I got my base colors, and that's fine. But what I really need to do is take a look at transmission. Anything more than 0 is going to make it slightly transparent. It might not be very much, but even with a 0.1, our representation here has already started to change. We haven't really seen anything here yet. But as we increase this more and more, until we get to a 1, this is now going to be just essentially made of glass. Well, neat. Now, the next thing I can do is kind of come in here into the transmission, and I can change the color to make it a colored glass. Sorry about that. I needed to clear my throat, so I paused for just a moment, but we're back. But that actually did let us go ahead and see what this looks like a little bit more rendered out at a little bit better quality. So this color under transmission is where we're getting all of the actual color from. Now that we had that in general, the color that we had in our base isn't really going to do anything at all now. So I'm going to go ahead and just leave this back to a white, just because that might change something a little bit in the future. But now that we have transmission at anything more than 0, it's going to really get all of its information from this one. So whatever color we want to go with, it's going to pull its colors from here. So I'm going to go with this nice light blue. Yeah, that'll be good. So far, so good. Well, we still have more in here. So after that, we have depth. Now, depth can give us a few issues just depending on the numbers we put in based on the size of everything. So it might take me a little bit, but what depth does is mostly for, something a little bit more like liquid, but it gives us more or less another side, or a thickness of how much we want to be in the glass itself. Okay, so once again, we can go ahead and take a look at a few things. So with depth, if I go ahead and zoom in up here, we can see that it's a little bit thinner up top for where it's just thinner compared to some of the main body. And if I change this to something a lot bigger, we can zoom in and kind of see the same thing going on here and there. So at the parts that are more thin, it's more clear, If the parts are a little bit thicker, it's more thick, which is exactly what we want to do. But we have this. We also have this called thin-walled, which when we turn it on, really thins up to kind of just make it a real thin shell around the entire piece of glass anyway. Now, if we have both of these at the same time, you'll note nothing really changes because the thin wall is going to do a pretty good job of overriding the overall thickness that we'll have with the depth. Okay. Now, with this, we also have a few other things that we can do. So, I'm going to go ahead and undo that just for the moment. Now, underneath this, we also have Advanced. And in Advanced, we have these two options. Well, first, we're going to look at the roughness. Well, the roughness right now is mostly going to be based on this one up here. Now, if this was set to a 0, everything's much more see-through and glass-like. But if I increase this number, it adds a little bit of a frostiness to the glass that I have here. And if I combine some of these things together, like thin-walled, I can get some great effects for having just the outside being, just a little bit frosty. From there, I also have the IOR that I can change depending on how much I want for the object itself. Now, that said, you can search out the IOR for any object for whatever it is, whether it's water, glass, grass, whatever. But this will come into play a little bit. Regardless, so this is the roughness itself. But if I set it back to a 0, I also have the roughness here. This one adds it in a little bit different place. So while the roughness up here under specular kind of adds a frosted outer shell to it, the extra roughness down here under advanced in the transmission group is going to add that frosted effect underneath the glass. So I can maintain the specular outer effect, but still have a bit of that internal frostedness. Well, awesome. But there's still a few other things we can do. Well, the next thing to kind of take a look at is this. And I'm going to go ahead and turn this roughness to a 0 and go back to just white. And I'll turn off thin-walled for the moment. So we go back to this original effect of this transparent glass. But we also have this, Dispersion Abe. And this gives us access to do something that's kind of neat. So, most people are familiar with the concept of a prism. Something that turns a source of light into multiple colors. Well, that's what this can do for this kind of object. So I'm going to start real low and put it at a 0.1. And instantly, I'm getting some real weird, odd color combinations. And I can see a little bit of that prism effect going on in the object now. But as I go up further and further and add more of it, and for this I need to let it render out just a little bit more, but I can start to get those color prism splitting of the light that we can see over here, down here, and just kind of based on the shape of the object itself, the teapot's turning into a little bit more wavy, kind of like this, but it still has that prism aspect right through here. From there we can do other things by changing, depth of the objects. We can put on the thin-walled, but if we do that, it kind of takes that away. But we have the ability to go through, change some of this. So I might give it a little bit of that frosted roughness on the outside, which this at a 1 might be a little bit much, because you can see it's kind of fighting with itself. and it's really just kind of blurring everything. But a small one will let us have a little bit of the frosted outside, which will give us this nice kind of fuzzy light beam connection, as opposed to just the solid linear prism splitting. So with these combinations together, we have a lot of aspects that we can do. If I keep going and I go back and add in some of these other colors, we can mix a little bit together, but now because of the Abe on there, it's going to turn this blue into a little bit more of a split color. But the closer I bring that to white, the more I can kind of mix the two aspects together into one. So I can add just little hints of the color there. Or even come up to this specular and add it in up here just to get a little bit extra of that color combination, but still get those light effects from the prism down here. Now, as far as glass goes, this is kind of as far as it really can go in many regards. So, like right now, I kind of have this like bubbly, solid looking glass here, but I can do a little bit more with that. Because the next category to take a look at that works with this is going to be down here under emission. So this is where I can actually turn my object into a light source. Now I'm going to go ahead and make another object in here, just so I got something just to kind of bounce things off of. Okay, so I have it. I'm going to hit my render. And with all those effects in there, I'm still getting, some nice little color variation in here. But as it's going to render through, it's going to kind of blur that out a little bit more. But now with this and these things being a source of light, I can go ahead and delete this light. And let's see what we kind of ended up with now. So I still have the overall light for the scene, so, I lost out on a little bit of the extra shadows and stuff. But now with this, I'm fully able to illuminate these objects, and we can even see that just a little bit down here onto the object by itself. And we can go through and have them illuminate into different colors, which will work with the other effects, but the more I turn up the emission, the more light source they will create overall. So if I kind of undo a little bit, just until I get that light source back, I'll go ahead, come back into here, increase the light source for the emission. I'll give it a little bit more of that color. And now, even on this object, I can see the light from these objects being cast. Now, I have the one sphere here, which isn't going to give us a lot of detail to look at like this, but the teapot will. And with it, we can still see the full shape of it, minus just a little bit of hard to see aspects. So let me change the color. There we go. So now with a little bit different color, it's a little bit easier to see. I'll crank up the emission pretty heavily. I'll put it at, say, a 500. And I'm still able to get the design and look of the teapot. Obviously, the sphere is a sphere. But with this, I get to keep the design, but I'm able to illuminate the scene with that by itself. I'll close this for a moment, and I'm going to grab the light source up here. I'm going to zoom in, and just to keep things a little bit easier to see, I'm going to go ahead and just remove some of the lighting off of this. Now, with the emission for the color that we gave it, it's going to do a whole lot to fill the scene with that color specifically. And this is going to be blinding, so give me just a second. So I've dimmed that light, but I'm still getting some of it over here for this side of the object. But the objects here that are now being emissive are just flooding the scene with that base color. Now, if I set it back to something a little bit brighter, something closer to white, it's going to just mix with all the other light in the scene and once again make it blinding. So I'm going to need to pull this back pretty heavily overall. In this case, based on the other light and the changes I gave it, I even need to go down to real low numbers, almost to a 0.1, which, once again, based on the other things I've been doing and what I have done, I get this really neat illuminating, almost rainbowy effect on the teapot, which personally I really enjoy seeing like this. But that's a look at doing glass and illumination inside of Arnold with just some of these basic, simple materials.